A good pilot is technically competent at flying the airplane. That's, they can fly the airplane. I think that's the first thing that makes a good pilot. They have the passion and curiosity to realize that what they did today and what they know today is not good enough for tomorrow. And that they always have to challenge themselves to be a better pilot. And by that, either perhaps more flying skills, perhaps more reading and involvement about emerging technologies, about what's coming next, and about a thought process of, we talked about before, just not going for an airplane ride and actually flying the airplane.
Dr. Michael Gillen is the Senior Manager of Fleet Standards of the Boeing 737 for a global airline based in the United States. He strategically directs and provides ongoing management of the 737 fleet curriculum development and standardization of all flight training-related policies, procedures, and FAA regulatory operational practices for 4,300 737 pilots. He holds a Ph.D. in Aviation Science from the University of North Dakota. His dissertation was on the effects of startle training on professional pilots. In this conversation, we discuss safety, airmanship, and his journey through aviation. I hope you enjoy listening. This is 5x5 with Scott Corley. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Scott. It's my pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to chat with you today.
You've done a lot of work, including your dissertation for your PhD on Startle Effect. What do you have that you can tell the listeners about your work on Startle Effect and what each pilot needs to understand for dealing with situations where they find themselves not knowing what's going on in an airplane because they're so rattled from an incident that just happened?
When we think about startle effect, we think about, people call it surprise, startle, scare. I think, in my opinion, and as it relates to professional pilots and people in general, to me, they're all the same thing. It's just the magnitude of the cognitive issues associated with the event that really determine whether it's a slight startle, a surprise, or a full-blown physiological and psychological response to whatever the stimuli is. I think it's innate to everybody. It's part of the fight or flight hard coding in our the way we are, and I don't necessarily think it can be trained out of anybody. I think that we can train pilots to recognize the symptoms of startle. And if you train them over a wide area of stimuli, they'll be used to it and perhaps not be startled by the same event again and again and again. But if a new set of stimuli, approach a pilot, or they're seen with a situation they've never seen before, they'll still have the same response. And it's just not airline pilots, it's fighter pilots, it's submarine operators, it's nuclear power plant operators. We all have this surprise response to stimuli that really overpower or our cognitive ability to effectively deal with what's going on. And what I would say for pilots or people that operate complex machines, that they just have to survive for about 30 seconds. If they can live that long, and when I say live that long, and let's relate it to aviation, if the pilots can keep the airplane under some sort of control for the next 30 seconds after the onset of the startle event, their chances of successfully mitigating whatever happened to them are fairly high. If they lose control of the airplane in that 30 seconds, the chances of recovery are drastically reduced. And we can see that in two classic incidents. If you look at Air France 447, they go from controlled flight to pretty much out of control in less than 30 seconds. Gillen Airlines goes from basically in control to impacting the ground in less than 30 seconds. So the airplane gets away from the pilots at the onset of a startle event. Air can get away from them very rapidly. So if they can live for the next 30 seconds, they'll probably regain enough of their cognitive function to be able to more successfully mitigate whatever the event was.
Okay, so live for the next 30 seconds. How do you talk about recognizing, hey, they're in this Is it a heartbeat? Is it a you're suddenly just finding yourself somewhat disoriented, wondering what the heck just happened? Where because if I'm hearing you correctly, and tell me if I'm not, you're trying to promote an awareness that when an event like this happens, you kind of want people to be of the mindset, live for the next 30 seconds. So what's the triggering event? What's the mindset that people should have around, sort of training themselves that they're going to be in that position, or in recognizing the onset of that? I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Of course, my suggestion, and I can only speak about my own response to a startle effect, and I would describe it as a set of general confusion, just a fogginess. I don't really know exactly what's happening, and that's my own response to being startled. Yours may be somewhat different, but I would take a look at the things that have happened to a pilot during flight that have been disturbing to them, things that have maybe gone great or not gone great, or things that popped out of the blue, and think about how they felt right at the onset of that. And I think that each person would describe it, how they feel, as a little bit different. I don't notice increased breathing, or I wouldn't notice an increased heart rate unless it was really, really high. But in that first 30 seconds, I don't think that any of those things would be evident to the pilot. So for me, it's confusion. And what I would describe as, when you've had that feeling, that's when you have to have a set of procedures that you've established for yourself, or training that you've established for yourself, that can help you, what I would say, bridge the cognitive gap. Because when someone is surprised or startled, and different people will actually say that they're different responses. Again, I don't necessarily think they are. Um, but when their full cognitive function will be impaired for not a long time, 15 to 60 seconds. But, 60 seconds is really at the far outset. The average would probably be from the full blown startle effect of cognitive impairment to fully regaining their cognitive functioning. There's probably 30 seconds at the outset. But for in that period of 30 seconds, if the pilots realize or feel that confusion, I would recommend a simple, very simplified thinking system. I'm going to set a pitch. I'm going to set a power. I'm going to have the wings level, and I'm just going to wait and see what happens. And then after that first 30 seconds, now their full cognitive function is back, and they can really start to analyze what's happening with the airplane. Is it nose high? Is it nose low? Is it fast? Is it slow? But we're just trying to get the airplane somewhat stabilized, or any complex machine somewhat stabilized for that 30 seconds. And it goes by pretty fast. And then from there, once the full cognitive function is back, they can really use all their analytical skills and all their experience to try to figure out what's actually wrong. Because what happens in that first 30 seconds after being startled, from a cognitive standpoint, and I have to say that I am not a psychologist, and I would not claim to be, but the thinking process is very much simplified. What people will do is they'll look for patterns. They'll look for a pattern match. And if the pattern they select, think of it as if I'm an old guy now, a Rolodex, if the Rolodex pattern they select is appropriate for what's happening with the complex machine, or in our case of our conversation, airplane, they'll be highly successful in recovering the airplane. If the pattern that they select is not exactly what is happening with the airplane, once they select that pattern, in general, pilots or people in general will be very committed to that pattern, whether it's accurate or not. And if it's not accurate, it's not appropriate, all of the cognitive biases now are working against them to stick with that pattern. And they'll start to disregard other information that would contradict the pattern that they chose. So what I'm trying to say for pilots is, in that first 30 seconds, stabilize the airplane, give themselves enough time so they can select the correct mental model of what's going on using all their cognitive facilities, and then they have a much greater success of recovering the airplane.
Okay, so in your dissertation, uh, you actually used real world training events in the simulator, correct? Was there more specific training other than just live for the next 30 seconds and stabilize the aircraft, or was it, what's the specific training you gave?
I did, and I'll talk a little bit about if your viewers or listeners, like research and like research on airline pilots, they will generally not find that much. If go to Google Scholar and try to look at studies on airline pilots, you typically don't find that many. It is very difficult to do research on airline pilots just because of the fact that, if you're an outside researcher and you go to an airline and say, hey, I want to do some research on your airline pilots, they will generally say no. The European carriers are a little bit more flexible, but that's really about it. That's why we don't see that much research. So for my research, what I did, and we've discussed it, that I am a pilot for a global airline. I was able to not convince the pilots union, but the management of the company I work for of this study that I was doing, and then it's all in coordination with the University of North Dakota and their Industrial Relations Board and Protection of Human Subjects. I visited crew members after their continuing qualification training, and it was on their last day of training. It was very random. I would show up to the simulator because they typically get done with extra simulator time, and ask them if they wanted to participate in my study. And I briefly described what the study was, and it was for my Ph.D. dissertation. When I assured them I was not taking their name, once their results were recorded and reported in the final paper of the dissertation, all of the notes and all of the original data was destroyed. And I separated them into two groups. I separated them into a high altitude startle and a low altitude startle. And within those groups, I had two subgroups. So I would say a trained subgroup and an untrained subgroup. And then I recorded their results against a standard scale, a standard grading, a 5-point grading scale, and tried to determine whether the trained group was significantly better than the untrained group in both high altitude, the sudden onset of a catastrophic issue, and then the low altitude was a slow buildup in pressure, as far as airplane running out of time and fuel, and the weather being a challenge to induce the startle effect to them. I did find in the end that the trained group, with some very simplified training, which we've talked about already, just basically level the wings, set a pitch, set a power, and then wait for that 30 seconds. The trained group was significantly better than the untrained group, just left to their own devices about how to handle the startle effect or their own experience.
Okay, so it's analogous almost to like an unreliable airspeed recovery. So you're setting a specific pitch, a specific power, knowing that will probably keep you safe, wings level, and then just regain your senses. Is it?
I think that is a very good analogy. We're just trying to somewhat stabilize the airplane, keep it in somewhat of a flyable condition. Okay. In relationship to pitch power, and it may be climbing, descending in a slight turn. It could be any of those, but is in a reasonably flyable condition during that 30 seconds that the pilots were getting their full mental and cognitive facilities.
Were there different specific startling events you would use in that low altitude scenario? So you've got degrading weather, airplane being dispatched to the destination with approximately 55 minutes of gas. So there's not a ton of hold. There's a lot of time pressure for someone being issued a hold when they're expecting to arrive at the destination with good weather. What did you introduce as the startling effect?
So for the low altitude scenario, what I introduced is they were approaching an airport, and there was day VFR and no expectation of delays or adverse weather. A typical day for any airline pilot in any large airport that we would generally operate into. Landing with about an hour of fuel, which is fairly reasonable. So as they approached the airport, the weather began to get worse. They started the approach still with reasonable weather. The weather got worse, and that necessitated a missed approach and then holding and then that started the event. So the added pressure of an unexpected missed approach, unexpected holding, with now very little fuel left on the airplane, forced them into making quick decisions and induce that startle. So I wanted to contrast the two. It would be easy to startle someone at an onset of a very sudden event, and that's a typical startle pattern what we see. But what I really want to look at is what I would call the slow burn, or the slow onset of a startle, where the events that are happening are outstripping the pilot's ability to deal with them in a timely manner. So in the low altitude, it was the combination of the airplane is getting perhaps critically low on fuel, and the options to land are becoming less and less and less with the onset of unexpected weather.
Okay. And what was the difference in the outcomes, trained versus untrained? A little bit better, generally better?
Well, when we talk about academic creative research, what we're talking about is what we call significant or statistically significant. And if you break it down, all statistics is trying to predict if your results are random or by chance. And not only that, predicting what is the percent chance that your results are random. In academia, if you can prove that your results have less than a 5% chance of being random, then that's what we'd call statistically significant.
Okay.
Significant results. I did see significant results both in the low altitude scenario and the high altitude scenario between trained pilots and untrained pilots with respect to this startle effect. So I would say that what that would say as a researcher is that the training that was applied, or the correction or the control that was applied, has probably a better than a 95% chance of that control having some effect on the pilot's performance. And that's what it's telling you.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to pivot away from this and just speak more broadly about all the different roles. You sent me your CV. It's quite impressive. You've done you have been involved in many different programs and led many different initiatives. You just talked about measuring your results. Being able to implement changes, how central is the ability to measure your results incorporated into any effort in general that you initiate? Because you've been involved in overseeing and running the command course for newly upgrading captains. You're on the Flight Safety Foundation's. You're on a committee for the Flight Safety Foundation. You have been involved in screening and selecting new hire pilots and helping oversee the training that these new hire pilots would be receiving. How important is it? Nice to have, or is it kind of need to have when you're implementing changes, knowing that you're going to be able to measure your results?
For me personally, based on my background in academics, it's vitally important, because I would say that most global airlines, they collected an enormous amount of data that any researcher would love to have. But I don't think as an industry, we do a great job of analyzing that data. And what I would tell my boss and the people I work for, if you can't analyze the data and you can't analyze it effectively, it's probably not worth your time actually collecting, because most airlines do spend a lot of time and money collecting data. But too many organizations are interested in averages or stroke counts, or why do I have 4 more missed approaches this month than last month? And what I would say to them is, having a background in statistics and research, what that will allow us to do is that allows us to have an objective look at data and analyze it from a researcher standpoint and say, well, your 4 missed approaches last month, they didn't mean actually anything. We can't say from a statistical standpoint that they were meaningful. It would show that they're random if we did some basic statistical testing on it. Or on the other side, your four missed approaches were statistically significant, there's a better than a 95% chance that there is something going on that we should look deeper into. So I think having that background allows me to focus my efforts and say this is worth looking into because it has a high probability there's some influence working here, or no, this is probably not actually worth our time looking at because we can't say with any degree of certainty that these results were random or by coincidence. So that's what I think that a background in data, and I'm not a data expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do have the background that allows me to look at data objectively and really point out to my airline or the Flight Safety Foundation, which is a absolutely fabulous organization, and I'm honored to be on their international advisory committee. It allows us to take that data, objectively look at it, and say yes, something is probably here. We should look deeper, or perhaps we should keep looking because we don't really see anything significant.
Can you give me an example of both that you've seen in the last couple of years, broadly from, global aviation trends? Can you give me an example of something where you felt that there was a groundswell of people wanting to act on a certain matter and you thinking, this probably isn't the issue that we think it is, and one that goes the other way?
Sure. So every year I take our average IOE time across each fleet, and I look at captains, first officers, and then within first officers I look at new hire first officers and regular first officers. I look at IOE time and IOE segments in each of those subgroups. And I'm particularly look at the 737 because that's the fleet that I manage. So 2021 data first. I didn't look at 2020 because of COVID and it was very unusual. But 2019 will be another good contrast. So at my airline, we're like every other global airline, we're hiring quite a few pilots, and we're a little bit behind in IOE scheduling. The pilots are sitting a little bit longer than would normally be expected. Another week, maybe two, not a huge amount of time. But what I looked at in 2019 versus 2021 was the effect of that sit time. Was the amount of time pilots were sitting have an effect on the average IOE time and average IOE segments? So when I looked at the data, I determined, yes, there was a significant difference in IOE time and segments between 2019 and 2021. And when you take the other noise out, with the new hires background, where how much flying they had done before they came to the airline, when you took that out, and by taking out, I mean you just increase the sample size to have, if you have a sample size of perhaps more than 30 to 40, you would have what we would generally refer to as a normal population, a normal distribution. When you take that out, you try to look at the effect of this one thing, sit time. And we did see that it was significant, that the sit time was actually producing real effects on our new hire pilots. And from there, you could really concentrate your efforts on hiring new LCAs and getting them checked out to try to really reduce that time to an optimum time, closer to perhaps a week. So that's an example of where we really should focus our efforts.
That's
an
great.
Example of perhaps, yeah, thanks. An example of using the same type of analysis, we look at our unstabilized approach rate, which for the industry is about 3% unstabilized approach rate. And the go-rounds from an unstabilized approach are, as an industry again, are abysmal, about 10% or less, the pilots that go around from an unstabilized approach. So when we look at the rates from one month to the next, we see very little variability. 1 month might have 5, the next month has 10, the next month has 7. And when you look at the variability and the changes that we've put in place to try to mitigate both unstabilized approaches and try to promote going around for an unstabilized approach, checklist changes, newsletter articles, we, even as an industry, do not see a statistically significant change in the behavior of our pilots. So in that case, you would look at the data and say, what we did was probably not effective or not effective enough to be significant. And when I say statistically significant, I'm talking from an academic standpoint. And then the standards for different industries can certainly be different. For instance, statistically significant for academia is 95%. Statistically significant for the medical industry might be far less. It might be 70%. But I still use the 95% as a general guideline. And so I would say, even if we saw a reduction in unstabilized approaches and an increase in go around, I would say we could not say with any degree of certainty it was because of the changes that we put in place. So that would say we should either refocus our efforts and make bigger changes, or, say that the changes we made, we really can't say with any degree of certainty that they were effective.
So I want to jump down that rabbit hole for just a second here with regard to unstable approaches. You mentioned the go-arounds from unstable approaches industry-wide. You use the adjective abysmal. I am aware that I believe it was about 10 or 15 years ago that it became the IATA recommendation that everyone have place responsibility on the pilot monitoring at around the 1,000-foot gate, that they will call, if it's unstable, they will call it unstable and they will call the go around. As being the data guy that you are, did you have a takeaway? How effective was that change?
I think that change had a unmeasurable effect. I would say it was not statistically significant. I don't think we could say for any degree of certainty that change has moved the needle. Now, I am involved with the Go Around Decision Making Project, both at the Flight Safety Foundation and a little bit at my airline, that we're looking at a group called the Presage Group, and led by a Ph.D. Marty Smith. I've known Marty for many, many years. A cognitive psychologist, and he has come up with some unique ways of surveying an airline's pilots to determine what their culture is and what their cognitive norms are. And from that process, he's developed, or works with Air, develop a set of, I would say, customized SOPs and callouts based on the airline's prevailing culture that seems to have a significant effect on decision making in the approach phase and decision making in the go around phase. I'm a big fan and big supporter of his work. I think it's based on science. It's based on research. It's peer reviewed, which for me says you could really see some significant results. So I think just the dynamics of the crew environment hamper the pilot monitoring from calling and go around. It's much easier for the captain, of course, to tell the first officer to go around from an unstabilized approach, and it's within their cognitive thought processes, and it's within what they would consider their absolute right in command of the airplane. And maybe that's not the correct term, but their responsibilities in command of the airplane. Conversely, when it's the first officer trying to command the go around, I think that from a cognitive standpoint and a culture standpoint, I think that's much more difficult. Now, I think that can be overcome by really how the captain approaches the first officer and how they interact with the first officer. For instance, Mike Gillen's technique is, when I brief the approach, I brief what the expectations are at our gates. And I tell the first officer, I expect you to tell me if I'm not stabilized at these particular gates. And I do expect you to tell me to go around if I become unstabilized below the final gate or at any point thereafter. So I set the expectation to the first officer. This is what I expect from them. And I think that I might get better compliance if I'm unstabilized versus, the captain who is perhaps a little bit more gruff, a little bit more, different in their command thinking. You could easily hamper the first officer from speaking up in a critical situation. So I think that although the concept is good at the pilot monitor calling the go around, I think its practicality and application is somewhat limited by the dynamics of how we fly airplanes.
That's a great answer. Let's use that to segue into, you helped lead and develop a command course the command development program. Um, right now, we've got a pilot shortage, which means we're going to have throughout the industry some really junior captains entering into the left seat. Talk a bit about how to mentally prepare oneself for taking command of the airplane. Give some of the biggest takeaways from your command course, if you could. And I mean, because you just sort of touched on, you modeled their excellent leadership in your briefing, basically letting the first officer know that you expect, him to use his judgment should he be seeing something that you're not catching or that you're behind the plane on. And that's a huge boundary and a huge wall to break down to ensure that it stays broken down in your flight deck. That way you get all of that guy's skills and expertise as well. Just talk a little bit about what you see going on in the industry right now, how much this experience matters, and how much the right attitude in the command seat matters.
Scott, I think it matters quite a bit. And I'm going to relay a story from a very wise pilot, Captain Jim Corley. You might remember him or know him
Maybe.
intimately. And I think about him each time I fly, and the things he talked about, and the lessons that he probably instilled in me and had no idea. I think he was the consummate professional, and I think if I could be half the professional that he was, I would consider myself very successful. But he gave me some advice when I had first checked out as captain. He said, you don't have to be a jerk in an argument you know you're going to win. And then it was said probably kind of glibly, but I really thought about that and really thought about command and how I would approach it. And look, I made my fair share of mistakes. I made my fair share of bad decisions. And there is no real substitute for that first set of experiences as a captain to shape the way, the captain commands an airplane. But I think the tone of initial captains is critically important. And in the airline that I work for, we started a command development course, many years ago. I was fortunate to be a part of it. It was handed to me from a group of dedicated, passionate professionals, and I fostered it along, and they handed it off to another group of dedicated, passionate professionals who've really probably expanded it greatly. But we really tried to instill the fact that, yes, the captain is in command of the airplane, and that's undisputed. But we try to instill in them that in order to get the best from the crew, that they had to have certain, characteristics and openness about them. Otherwise, it would be very easy to be an autocratic captain that we've seen the movies and on TV and we laugh about and we all know them. But it is much more difficult to be that mentor, be that encourager of discussion and ideas, and then trying to get the best out of your first officer to make a decision. And I think that's what we're trying to instill. We're trying to instill in captains that, oh, look, ultimately it's the captain's decision, and they will have to make it, and they will be accountable for the decisions that they make. But to make the best decision, they have to foster an environment that really promotes the expression of ideas and alternatives, and to actually consider them before making the decision, and then, of course, making that decision, that they're legally obligated to make.
So, one of the things that I know happens to new captains, it happens to transitioning captains at various airlines where maybe they have a lot of command experience, but suddenly they're finding themselves with precious little experience in the type of airplane. Picture someone that's been on the 737 for 10 years and now they're going to transition to the Airbus, right? And it's like almost having to speak a different technical language, but although the command philosophy is the same. One issue that I know sort of vapor locks some people in training is sort of an indecisiveness, right? And so how would you coach, or how would you talk about just the idea of generally like, hey, listen, you've got to make decisions. And and you're going to try and make the best ones you possibly can using all the resources you can. But at the end of the day, you have to make decisions. You want to make the best one, but you certainly maybe also want to guard against just maybe not making the worst decisions. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit from your perspective?
From my perspective, and when I do IOE with new captains, which I greatly enjoy, I think it's one of the great parts of my job is checking out new captains and new first officers. But what I encourage them to do is work from what they know. Start from a place of what they know and what they've experienced before, gathering information from whomever they can. That might be dispatch, that might be the first officer, and then forming what I would call Plan A. Plan A has XYZ tenants. And once they start on Plan A, I encourage them not to be committed to it and always ask not only themselves, but ask their flying partner, have we considered everything? Is there something we're missing? And I encourage them to do that on a repetitive scale, perhaps every 5 to 10 minutes. Something I think it helps initial captains to have some gates or some time hacks. Every 5 minutes, I'm going to ask myself, did I consider everything? Did I consider the weather? Did I consider the fuel state? Did I listen to the first officer? And I'm going to ask the first officer the same questions. Is there anything that I'm missing? Did I miss some weather? Did I miss something from dispatch? Are you comfortable with this plan? Do you think this plan is reasonable? Do you have any other ideas? And I think just not offering that lip service, but being, truly committed to it. Are we considering everything on a repetitive scale? That it helps the captain not only consider things they might have missed, it helps them not being committed to Plan A when perhaps Plan B or C is better. And if they did consider everything and their initial plan is the best plan, it helps to reaffirm that plan and give them some confidence in the decision that they made. So I kind of think about it as like a 3-step process. And I offer that to new captains until they get comfortable and until they get enough experience that they can, maybe forgo that, or I personally still do it. But it helps them in getting that initial experience.
That's great. Another thing that you've been involved with is screening for hiring. One of the goals of this podcast is that it might be a resource for people who are looking to get into aviation in general and become pilots. And it's sort of under the inspiration of my father. My father loved encouraging people to get into the industry. And this is what's so special about interviewing you right now, because I feel like you are his best success story as far as encouraging someone and how far they went into the industry and how deep and looking at your 5-page CV, but also hearing you talk, it sounds like you have loved aviation from the second that you went for that first airplane ride. Was it in a Cherokee 6 or was it in a Lance?
It was a Cherokee 6.
Okay.
You may not remember this, Scott, but at one time your father took me, you, and your brother to fly the 727 simulator at JFK at the TWA training facility. And
I do remember it. I was too
I
scared to get in it.
I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember our conversations. I remember flying the simulator, and of course, I remember flying with your dad in his airplane. And that ignited a lifelong passion for aviation. And I've been so fortunate in the people that I've considered a mentor and the people that have helped me along the way, that I've been able to follow this passion and this dream to different paths that it's led me. I mean, it's had some ups and of course some downs, but overall I wouldn't trade it for anything. And it's been a lifelong love of aviation and the different aspects that involved in aviation. I've been a pilot for my airline for 27 years, and I still love to go fly the airplane. And it's really not only been a job and a career, but a passion for me. And then I knew at a young age that this is what I wanted to do. And I'd encourage your listeners, if they have that same burning desire to follow a path in aviation, to do it, to try to do it, because it is so rewarding to have a career that is also your passion and interest. And And I mean, some days it's going to work, but most days it's really not. It's just it's continuation of following, your dream and your passion and the things that you really like to do.
So, and here's the interesting question to follow on from that. How do you balance like aptitude versus passion and curiosity? I mean, I talk to various people a lot. Sometimes it's flight attendants, sometimes it's just people who are outside of the aviation industry and they're thinking about becoming pilots. And my advice to them is, hey, listen, go take an introductory flight lesson. If you find yourself getting lit up with curiosity that you want to know more about, hey, why am I maintaining certain airspeeds? Why is it important to hold altitude? And you find yourself thirsting with a creative curiosity to understand more and more about it, then this is probably for you. Conversely, if you think it sounds cool to get the days off and the money that a pilot gets, and you're not lit up with the wanting to know more and more about aviation, do not come to this job. You will be the most miserable person at this job because the money and the days off are not are not
Not
the
worth it.
reward that you would
No,
hope that it is. But towards that end, so you need to have the curiosity, you need to have the passion. But on the other hand, you also have to have a certain aptitude. And you have been involved in, I believe, measuring aptitude, for your airline. But is there any advice you could give to someone who's just thinking about getting into it in general? Like, how can they get a sense of their aptitude and whether or not they're going to head down the path and invest all this money in this career? Are there any quick hacks one could take towards knowing if this is likely going to be in their wheelhouse?
I think that's a difficult question, Scott. I don't think there's any one particular personality trait or personality that makes a great airline pilot or a great pilot in general. I think your advice of go try an introductory flight, go get a private pilot's license, and if you find yourself being able to do it and something that a person really has a thirst for and a thirst to know more, then I think you should explore it further. But I think your advice is also good. If you look at a person like me or you, yeah, we have fairly nice schedules and we go to interesting destinations. But if you're in it for that, I think you'll be disappointed in your career choice. Because although laying over in particular cities is fun and then you get to do some interesting things, really the fun part is to actually fly an airplane there. And after a while, most cities are about the same. And I would say to your listeners, most airline pilots do the same thing in every city they lay over in, whether it's visiting bike shops that I like to do, or going out for hiking. It becomes somewhat of a routine. And the interesting part is actually flying to that city. And the interesting part is dealing with, the airport or the weather or other, associated things with flying that are fun. And the layover is just part of it. And the fact that the job does, provide a stable living and, is a perk of the job. But if it's not their passion, if they don't have a burning desire to fly the airplane and know about aviation, I think that it may or may not be the job for them.
So right now we're in a once in a lifetime pilot shortage. What's your perspective on what the industry is doing to try to recruit, more pilots, and what can be done better, and does anything need to be done?
I certainly think that things need to be done. As you and I both know, the barriers to entry to aviation are very high. So I had the opportunity to speak to my daughter's fourth grade class a little while ago, and at the time she was a teacher in what they would call a Title I school. It was in the inner city in New York, and I had the opportunity to. It was a career day, and I showed up in my uniform and got to talk to them. I was the tallest person in the room for the first time in my life. which was interesting. But if we really want to attract the best of the best, that's where we have to start. We have to ignite the spark in children, in their grade school, perhaps, or definitely middle school, because by high school they have to start formulating a plan to become a pilot. I do think in the United States you will see more of a European model take place, where each global airline will probably have its own academy. United has one, United Aviate, Delta has one. I'm not sure about American, but I do think that we will see that type of model where global airlines are attracting people out of high school or out of college, training them the way they want, instilling their culture from day one, and then having them move from their academy to instructing their academy to their regional partner, and finally to their main line, as for lack of a better term. And I think that will have to be the model going forward, because it does a few things. Number one, it somewhat reduces the barriers to entry, and I say somewhat because I think today the academies for the global carriers, generally the students are paying some, or if not all, or some of the tuition. But I think I do foresee a model in the future where the airlines actually pay for it, or a majority of it, and that reduces that economic barrier to entry, which I think is a major factor in attracting pilots
Yeah.
to our industry.
What would you say about the idea of just installing a basic Microsoft flight simulator with a decent control yoke setup for kids in grade schools, maybe moderated, maybe not, to develop their own proficiency? Because I used to play with Microsoft Flight Simulator all the time, and sometimes I wonder, because the second I started taking flight lessons with Mark Avery at Somerset Airport, it's like, oh, you're a natural, and it's like, well, am I a natural, or have I just had a lot of practice, relevant practice until now, understanding, how a plane's going to behave near stall and different things like that, and that very first version of Microsoft flight simulator where you could land in Meigs Field and then you go down like Champaign or Urbana, and I think that was about it, right? But what do you see? Do you share that, like that's really relevant, and these can be very effective tools towards igniting that spark and developing competency?
I think we're on the precipice of that, and I think based on some of the new technology, the virtual reality technology that is being adopted in some training scenarios, it does certainly have some applicability. It really can help people just starting out to get some feel of what an airplane looks like, what it sounds like, how it reacts. What are the basics of flying? With pitch and roll and yaw, and what are the basics of instrumentation? Even if they don't quite understand what they're looking at, they would at least know the basics and the basics of flying. I think that is a great help. I don't think you can learn to fly over a Microsoft simulator and fly very well, but I think if a student or grade school or certainly middle school has an interest, I would definitely try Microsoft Flight Simulator or X-Plane and see if that further ignites their spark, and further ignites their curiosity into flying. But I think any practice is good if you want to get into this industry.
That's great. How do you think aviation in general, and all of the things that you know about the effectiveness of our industry? I mean, no other industry is as safe as our industry that I'm aware of. How can aviation inform other industries? And I know that you've done a little bit of work on that front.
I have done a little bit of work. I wouldn't say a lot of it. I mean, our work with the Flight Safety Foundation is one is all volunteers, and two we're from different parts of the industry. I did have the opportunity to work with the Children's Hospital a little bit, and the medical industry, and they have been trying for a long period of time to instill some of just the basics of what we would refer to as crew resource management into the medical field, to try to foster a more open environment and have a reduction in errors. So I think that for the airline industry, the concept of crew resource management or pilot resource management, it was called at the time, that iteration and that culture change took more than 20 years. From the first instances of, United Airlines having an accident in Portland in 1978 to when was pathway resource management or crew resource management really fully ingrained in the culture of most global carriers. I think that was 20 to 25 years before that mindset change. And I think that takes that long in any particular industry. I think the medical industry has, if we're using that as an example, has other barriers that the airline industry did not. One, they don't have an overall governing board like the FAA. Two, they're a much more close knit and tight community where, for instance, for an ASAP program at a global carrier, nobody knows who the pilots are, and most people probably aren't even familiar with what happened in the incident. But in the medical industry, people will know who the doctor was, and they will know of the incident. So it becomes much harder to instill that type of culture. Now, I think it can be done, and I think there are definitely progressive doctors and hospitals that are promoting it because it does in fact work, in the gathering of ideas and sharing of concerns. But it is a difficult culture change, and it takes a significant amount of time.
All right, I'm not sure that this is where I want to go, and at the risk of this is going to be kind of a silly question. The airlines have made huge strides, we are in a knock on wood, unprecedented level of airline safety, especially among United States carriers. You've got so many things that are all interconnected that have provided for that. You've got training, you've got flight standards, you've got the feedback loop that goes between training, flight standards, and the line. You have tools like ASAP, you have tools like FOQA, you have even things like, pilot peer support, you have HIMSS, you have professional standards committees, you have just the general culture and relationship between flight operations management, flight training management, and the line itself. And all of these things help feed that. So I'm going to set up an absurd hypothetical scenario, which is, and maybe you won't want to answer it, but if you knew that some tyrannical force was going to come in and burn down one of those little houses, right? That they were going to, I don't know, remove FOQA, remove ASAP, remove this flight standards concept or whatnot. Like, is there one particular house that you would kind of covet the most, that you would try to ensure that they're like, hey, I'm going to destroy any one of these things, but you get to protect one? Is there any one thing that is your, or is that too absurd of a scenario? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. And one, I do think they're all interconnected. And I think the airline industry is as safe as it is today because it's no one thing. It's multi-layered approach to safety. There's no panacea. There's no one thing that makes an airline absolutely safe. And there's no such thing, obviously, as absolutely safety. We think about in terms of an accepted risk. Now, accepted risk is very, very small. But if I were going to protect one thing, I think I would protect airlines' ASAP programs in the United States. Because what you can look at, if you look at US airlines, and they all have, I would say, robust ASAP programs. If you look at the global carriers, that is.
Yeah.
And the global carriers really, because of their culture of ASAP programs and because of, the pilots don't have a fear of repercussions based on their reports, there is a willingness to share safety incidents and pilot mistakes and in the events leading up to those mistakes. And I think that's the key to making airlines safer in the future, because it's hard to fix what you don't know exists, or what we would refer to as the latent failures that are in any systems. By latent failure, I mean there is a failure or hazard that lies within a system that is not uncovered until a mistake or an incident or an accident happens. And by having these reporting cultures, we really have a leg up on the latent failures in our systems. We can sometimes uncover and mitigate a potential risk or hazard before it occurs. And I think that is the importance of the ASAP programs, and the importance of fostering open reporting culture that it ultimately makes each airline safer. If you look at carriers in other parts of the world, um, they not only they don't have ASAP programs, but they use FOQA as a disciplinary tool. And I think really any culture that has that mentality, pilots that make mistakes, and I haven't met a pilot yet who hasn't made a mistake, they'll try to hide them because they fear for their job, or what the ramifications might be. And that type of culture not only doesn't uncover latent failures, it covers them up so that they don't bubble to the surface until a major incident or accident were to occur.
And I can't tell you how much I love that answer. Interestingly, it's the ASAP model. I feel like it's helped me become a better parent because I actually apply it to my own kids and my own role as a leader within my family and things like that. The first airline I got hired had a really draconian style of training department. They would shout you down, they would try and find fault, and they didn't have a training department. They had a checking department, And so shifting into working for other airlines that have a really just safety culture around ASAP, the idea was foreign to me of like, wait a second, we're not going to punish people for their mistakes. We're not going to use the stick. It's all going to be sort of carrots. I mean, to the extent it can. Obviously, ASAP doesn't forgive willful violations of SOP or federal regulations, but provided that you make a mistake, and it's interesting. I've even heard the definition of what is willful violation. That maybe you sort of make a bad decision in the heat of the moment, but what I haven't understood ASAP to be is like, like you don't go around from an unstable approach and the weather's fine, there's no mitigating circumstances, and you brief at the top of descent like, hey man, I've got to make my commute flight, we're not going around from any unstable approach. And then you fly an unstable approach and you don't go around. Okay, that is willful violation, and maybe that doesn't get accepted into FOQA, but heat of the battle, bad decisions do get accepted into ASAP, do get accepted, where someone then just gives the full narrative. Hey, you know what? I was feeling time pressure on my commute. And I'm using this example as a particularly bad reason to justify not going around, right? But on the other hand, if someone's just merely being honest about it, you as the airline manager, as part of the event review committee, you want the data. You want to actually know what was going on in someone's head, why the bad decision got made, why the error happened. And interestingly, and I don't know, perhaps whimsically, I found that concept, like just in my own life, you can be a better parent because you've got your kid does something wrong. You maybe want to yell and scream, or you maybe want to tell them why they were wrong, but it's better to fact find. It's better to go, hey, okay, you did this. It's not optimal. What was going on in your head? Really, just let's get to why did you do what you did? I don't know. I don't know if you want to add on to that.
No, I think you're right. So I think ASAP programs have a dual purpose, right? They allow the individual to examine their thought process and where that may or may not have been optimum in a safe space. And then from a company standpoint, and when I was served on the FSAP committee, I would tell the individual pilots that you made a mistake. I don't really care about you as an individual, and that's not the right order. I don't really care about the mistake as an individual. What I really care about is the outside events and your thought process that led you to make that mistake, and can we package that somehow and relay it to other pilots so they don't make the same mistake, or change our procedures so that mistake is harder to make, or some other mitigation. And I think it's the incremental increases in safety that we get from those programs that allow us to be a safer industry.
I heard someone say once that the best way to read about an aircraft accident or an aircraft incident, and maybe the operators in the incident make mistakes that you regard as totally absurd, that oh, I'd never do that, I would have done this, but that the best way to look at them is really from the perspective of, okay, absurd as it seems, how could I have made that same mistake? Is that how you view incidents?
Yes, because it's very easy to look back on an incident with hindsight and say, "Oh, I would have never done that. How could the pilots have made that mistake?" But what I like to look at an accident or an incident report is sitting down and trying to clear my mind and say, "How could I be led down the same path?" Given because what we don't see in the accident report is you see the whole report and not in the same view that the pilots saw it. They see the incident evolving in real time, and the clues or what's going on are sometimes not obvious, and they're sometimes come at inopportune times. But when we read an accident report, we read it all in the same time, and it's hard for us to separate the clues the crew is seeing, or what the accident sequence chain, because we can see it building, we can see what's going to happen. But if you take each individual clue what was happening to the crew in the time that they saw it, you have to place yourself in that position and say, could I make the same mistakes given the same clues and the same data and the same training that I have? In some cases, you might say, I probably would not make that mistake based on, I have different training, or my airline trains it differently. Or you could say, I could absolutely make that mistake based on, what the information that the crew had, the weather that the crew had, the time they had to make a decision. And I think that's really the value when you say, I could make that same mistake. And then the follow-on question is how do I interrupt that sequence not to make that same mistake again? How do I change my procedures? How do I change the flight manual? How do I change the way I approach this particular scenario not to make that mistake? And I think that's where the real value is.
That's great. So you graduated UND in 1993.
I did, yep.
At the risk of, I don't want to embarrass you by, reading your. Well, I'm not trying to embarrass you, and I hope it doesn't. But I'm looking at your CV here, and there's a relatively quick ascension. You got hired. You were a line first officer at the airline you're at now, starting in 95 to 97. And then in 97, you became an instructor pilot on both the 777 and the 737. And
I
then,
was, 737 first and the triple after that.
okay. So you go from graduating UND in 93 to 8 years later, in starting in 2001, you're the lead instructor pilot for the 777 and the 747. How did that happen?
A lot of luck, being at the right place at the right time, and being prepared, being at the right place at the right time. And my own dad would say, there's no such thing as luck. It's, being prepared at the right time is what really makes your luck. And that's what I'd say to anyone um, who is looking at getting an aviation. There's no substitute for being prepared. But I graduated from UND, and I was very fortunate, and I really enjoyed UND. And I have a lifelong passion for not only for flying, but for teaching. I was an instructor at UND, and I really enjoyed that. And I was an intern at my present airline when I was still an undergraduate, and that got me an opportunity to interview early and get hired at a young age. And from there, I started my career at the airline, and I started flying jets, which is something that I always wanted to do. And once I did that, I had to ask myself the question: is there more? can I expand on my intellectual curiosity um, to to do more? And that led me to be an instructor in the airplane that I was flying, the 737. And I love being an instructor pilot. And I always had a curiosity of long range international flying over water. Some people would think it's quite boring. I think it's one of my favorite things to do, fly over water. I don't know why, but I just like the thought of being accurate and knowing where the airplane is and knowing where I could go, and the plotting and just and long range navigation. So an opportunity came to go to the 777. They needed instructors, and they had enough on the 737, so I was able to do that right at the outset of when my airline was introducing the 777. We had brand new airplanes and brand new routes, and we were the first 777 to fly in the polar region, and the first airline to fly into really the deep South Pacific. So I was an instructor in the 777, and again asking myself the question, where does my curiosity lie now? What's next? And that led me into my first management job, which was the head instructor pilot on the 777. The current head instructor pilot decided to return to the line. I applied for the job and interviewed and was successful, and that started my career in management. And not only being a pilot and being an instructor, but managing instructors, and all of these experiences I've really enjoyed. And what I look for in different jobs at the airline that I'm at is what is going to suit my intellectual curiosity, and what is a challenge to make me better, because each new job comes with a new set of requirements and circumstances and responsibilities. And each new job, at least for me, is a challenge, especially at the outset of learning about the new job and being effective as a leader and a manager, and really trying to make a difference. Trying to improve upon an already great product is the way I think about it.
That's great. So you then upgraded to captain in 2004. So that is 9 years after you got hired.
That's correct.
Uh, how quickly did you move up to check airman after being captain? Did it happen simultaneously, or was there?
No, it was quite a while. So I upgraded in 2004 to the Airbus. I became an Airbus captain, and I decided in my wisdom that I was going to commute to reserve, which I wouldn't really necessarily recommend that. It was a 2 year, 2.5 year commuting to reserve, which I enjoyed being a captain. I did not enjoy commuting to reserve. So that I wouldn't necessarily recommend that path. But in every career, everyone makes some mistakes, and that's probably one of mine that I would not do again. And then the culture at the airline that I'm at, it was very difficult in the Airbus to break into be a check airman. I was not successful. I interviewed a few times, was not selected, and I think that's a good lesson to learn, especially in airline management, and especially, or at least at the company that I work for, is if you're not successful, but it's something you really want to do, keep trying. Keep trying and trying and trying, and don't get discouraged. Because if you have the will, the passion, each interview experience you'll learn from, you'll get a little bit better from, and then eventually your time will come. And then, you can step into a new role. So I was on the Airbus. I eventually got bumped off the Airbus when we were downsizing the pilot base that I was at. I probably wouldn't have left the Airbus if I didn't get bumped off it. I enjoyed flying it. And then I came to the 737. And I tell people now that in my 27 years at the airline, I haven't made it very far. I started on the 737, and I'm still on the 737. So I haven't made it very far in life and as a pilot, but I love flying the 737, and I flew it. I got hired, and I moved to the 737, and I flew it for 2 years, and then there was a need again for check airman, and this time I was successful, and I got selected as check airman, and then I flew as a check airman for several years before I again applied for my current job and was hired in my current job. So it's been just kind of a natural progression as I've moved through my career. I selected opportunities that I thought were interesting and suited my curiosity, and some I was been successful at, and most of the jobs that I tried for I was not. And that, led me to where I am here today.
That's great. Let's talk about the 737 for just a little bit. So I've got like
Sure.
2 more questions, and from what you told me, you've got about 10 more minutes. Does that sound about right?
Sure. I have as much. I have more than that. I'm
Okay.
I'm okay till we're done.
All right. I read one of the publications you put out to your pilots a couple months back, and you were strongly encouraging the 737 pilots to keep their hand flying skills sharp. And I love that. And I took it as a call to me, to myself. And I started actively hand flying a lot more, getting vectored into Newark, descending through 10,000. I would just, nice day, kick off the autopilot and hand fly, autopilot off, auto throttles off. And yeah, it really made a difference. And my confidence got a lot higher. Talk Is there something specific about the 7.3? Is it just the fact that we're flying a plane that was designed in the 60s or earlier? That I mean, hand flying skills are important in all aircraft, but somehow I spent 16 years on the Airbus, it feels more important in the 737. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think the 737, and in that same wise pilot, your dad, and I've shared this quote with you, said, there are a lot of pilots going for airplane rides. There are far fewer pilots flying airplanes. And that's somewhat of a paraphrase. But again, I think your dad said it in a glib manner, but it really resonated with me. And I really thought about, that quote. And I say that quote to almost everybody I fly with. And I think what is unique about the 737, I don't think it's necessarily a unique airplane, but I do think it is a unique airplane for our generation. So what I would say, the 737 and even the 737 MAX is a 1960s era jet with modern avionics. So in that era, in the 1960s, the 1970s, 1980s, the pilots had to fly the airplanes. They had to know what was wrong with the airplane from probably less than obvious clues. For instance, what two DC fail lights would mean in the 737. Whereas modern airplanes, even the Airbus A320, which is probably the oldest modern airplane, it will generally tell you what's wrong with it. So because of that, I think knowing the airplane is more important in the 737 than perhaps the 787. And due to the design characteristics of the 737, I think it is a more challenging airplane to fly. It doesn't offer any type of the things that modern airplanes have, as auto pitch trim and things like that. It is, in my estimation, it's still a 1960s era aircraft, and it is so much fun to fly. I think that it is the most fun airplane that I've ever flown, because kind of what you see is what you get, and the more skilled you are at hand flying it, the more fun it is to fly, and the less you'll be behind the airplane. And this is a real passion of mine, hand flying. And when I, talk to pilots, new hire pilots, new captains, I ask them, I said, what is the number one job of a pilot? I get some smirks, get some oddball answers. But the number one job of a pilot is the ability to fly the jet. And if you asked the traveling public, what is your expectation of your pilot today as far as ability to fly the airplane? I think that they would say, I expect my pilot to be able to fly the airplane in all weather, in all conditions, and at all times. And I think as a professional pilot, if you do not currently possess those skills, or perhaps are a little bit rusty or a little bit intimidated by that statement, I think that you should develop a program for yourself that gets you there, that you can fly the airplane in all weather, in all conditions, and at all times. And I think that's the basis of my attitude towards hand flying. And look, I certainly realize that I am kind of on the outer scale of hand flying the airplane. I generally fly it all the way up and all the way down, every leg, every day. And the only time I turn the autopilot is on an RF leg, on an RMP
Really?
approach because I have to, or when the weather's below Cat 1 minimums because I have to. And my thought process behind that is one, I absolutely love to fly the airplane. It's one of my favorite things to do. That's why I took this job because I like flying airplanes. But my other feeling is, and it relates back to Startle and and then my master's thesis, that a well-practiced pilot in all phases of hand flying will be able to more effectively handle the airplane in unusual circumstances because of that experience and knowledge base. When I would think about hand flying, I think about it as two different skills. It's a cognitive skill, a thinking skill, right? You have to know where the airplane is in space and time and in relationship to energy management. And it's also a motor coordination skill,
Yeah.
a physical skill, moving the controls. How much do I have to move the controls? Where should the throttles be during an approach? Can I set them without even looking at them? And it's the combination of those two skills that allow a pilot to fly a fairly complex machine. But those two skills degrade at fairly rapid rates. So,
Yeah.
based on my research for my master's degree, I would say that if you took an ATP pilot and then they did not fly significantly for approximately 6 months, their skill level would probably be closer to what a private pilot would be, as far as measurable pitch, power, speed, heading. So the skills degrade rapidly. And there's only one way to keep those skills current is to practice them. And if you look at greats, not in aviation, if look at you know greats in any sport, they continually practice every aspect of their sport. And I think the same is true for airline pilots. And I think a very important AC is about to come out. It's AC 120 FPM for flight path management. Kathy Abbott, who I've known a long time, a researcher with the FAA, and I have great respect for, is one of the authors of it. And even the FAA is going to acknowledge that our current policies at hand flying are really inadequate for the complexity of our operation. And they're not only going to encourage, but they're going to demand that the pilots be able to fly the airplane, hand fly the airplane in all phases of flight with all modes of automation from fully on to fully off. I expect to draft out this fall. And I have talked about it's going to be a major change to the way we check, train, and really approach flying. For instance, when I do line checks as a check airman, I generally start my watch when the crew starts to take off roll, and I stop it when they turn the autopilot on, and I turn it on again when they turn the autopilot off for the approach. And if you have a crew that likes to put the autopilot on, say 1,000 feet, turn it off again at 1,000 feet, I ask them, I said, how long do you think you're flying the airplane for? And they'll come up with all kinds of answers, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And I say, well, more like 90 seconds. And that's about how long. And I said, do you think that manipulating the controls of this very complex machine for 90 seconds at a time really prepares you for the whole gamut of scenarios where you may have to hand fly the airplane? And I generally agree that probably does not. And that starts the basis of encouragement to start to expand your hand flying repertoire. Perhaps if you haven't hand flown in a long time, turn the autopilot off, flying to O'Hare on a Friday afternoon, that may not be actually your best bet. But flying to Des Moines on a clear day, where there's no traffic, that's where I would recommend pilots start and build up to it, because you should be able to fly into O'Hare on a Friday afternoon in the weather if you have to. So that's kind of the way I think about it and the kind of way I approach it.
That really validates the experience that I had, because having spent 16 years on the Airbus, where even if you're hand flying on the Airbus, you're typically not turning the auto thrust off. And in fact, I believe it was the procedure at least one airline I've worked at, like, hey man, if you're going to turn the auto thrust off, you better brief that, your other pilot ahead of time. You don't want to startle them with that you're actually taking manual control of the aircraft. And so I kind of carried that into flying the 7.3. I was sort of in that rut of, maybe it might be a little higher than 1,000, but getting the autopilot on pretty quickly, turning it off at around 1,000 feet, maybe 1,500 feet. And I noticed every day that I was landing in significantly gusty winds. I mean, you got to work a lot harder flying a 7.3, landing in gusty conditions. Crosswind or headwind doesn't really matter. You're working a lot harder. Your motor skills are being tasked a lot harder than even if you're hand flying an Airbus, which is doing all the auto thrust changes, and you've got the fly by wire system, and its rate of roll and all of those things working for you to make it a lot less of a load. But I noticed after that period of like really practicing, I focused for a month or two. Okay, I'm going to turn off. I'm turning off the autopilot. I'm hand flying a lot more. Then I noticed at the other end of it, I flew a particularly gusty approach. There were wind shear advisories, all this stuff, and I just had that feeling of just like being in the pocket. You feel your motor reflexes are just responding automatically, and I felt like, wow, I had greater control over this plane, and it felt just more in control. And I know I kept even though there were big gusts coming, that I kept the airspeed dialed in there pretty close to where it would have been, and that was a lot better than letting the auto throttles respond and how it would have been otherwise automated in the Airbus or the 7.3. So I just want to give you props towards the recommendation, and I feel like it's validated by the experience. And also I remember the first couple months flying the 7.3 in gusty winds, you'd feel exhausted after landing. Whereas like after that approach, I felt kind of like, recharged, or a little bit like, my ego was being stroked a little bit because I felt like I did a good job of handling the aircraft. And so that's great.
I really think one begets the other, because by hand flying more, you'll naturally be better at it. And what it does, it reduces the cognitive load. So by practicing more, I don't have to think about it as much. For instance, I'm a management pilot, so I fly once or twice a month. And when I get in the airplane, I have to actually think about what I'm doing. It doesn't just flow for me. Now, after a couple legs, I have to think about it less, and that's that cognitive load is being decreased. And because a pilot is practicing more, they can fly the airplane better, but two, the amount of load on their system is less, and then they can devote more of that cognitive resource. I think of cognitive resources as perhaps memory in a phone. Every person only has so much of it, and if you can outstrip your ability to think. That's a well researched topic. So if by lowering the demands to hand fly the airplane by practicing, because you'll be better at it, you can devote more of that cognitive resources to noticing wind changes, reacting to the airplane as it's flying in gusty conditions, and you'll just be better at it. It's not a difficult concept. It's I tell people, use it or lose it as far as your flying skills. And the more wide range of variables that a pilot were to practice over, climbing, cruising, turning, slowing, complex maneuvers, the better they'll be at it. And that's not a difficult concept. But I think it's something that, as an industry, we've strayed away from for a long time, because look, the automation is very good. It's very accurate, but it will, over time, it's insidious. It'll rob the pilot's ability to actually fly the airplane. And that is an industry-wide problem that we're only really beginning to face.
So are there any data-based takeaways that you have of trends that you've seen in FOQA or ASAP data with regard to flying with the autopilot on versus hand flying? Are there any, I guess what I'm asking, how much is data informing your position here?
When we look at data, it would be difficult for us to say. We don't see necessarily an increase in mistakes or altitude deviations or nav deviations when pilots are hand flying the airplane, as you might expect. You might see a little bit more, a little bit less, but they are, back to our original conversation, statistically insignificant. I have heard the argument that by one pilot hand flying the airplane, it really loads up the other pilot. I would say there's no academic research to support that. It's one of those things that have been discussed and talked about year in, year out, and because people have discussed it, I think it's true. I am actually on the opposite side of that argument. I think when, for instance, I am hand flying the airplane, that makes my first officer be more engaged with what I'm doing. So he or she has to, set the altitude or the heading or the speed for me. And it gives them that one last check. Hey, did you really want that? No, that speed doesn't make sense. Whereas if I have the autopilot on, I'm setting it myself, that check and balance is not there. So I think when one pilot's hand on the airplane, the other pilot can't be along for the ride. They have to be engaged in the flight path management of the airplane. So I actually think it makes a better flight crew versus loading up one of the other pilots. I don't really subscribe to that argument, and I've seen no research to support that.
Love it. All right, so this leads to the question of automation. One of the looming threats out there, in some people's mind, is that the industry is going to want to evolve to pilotless airplanes. What are your thoughts on that? Just what are your thoughts on that?
I can relate it to. I was just this weekend on a trip with my wife and my son. I rented a Tesla because I don't have one and I actually really like one, but I wanted to see what the auto driving was all about. So, I would say that the auto driving on a Tesla is probably the most advanced driving system out there. And if you relate it to aviation, the one thing that automated systems can't do is they can't think. They're programmed in a binary yes no, but there's no gray in an automated system, and to my knowledge, there's none developed yet. So because there is no gray, and because it has to be a binary yes no, I think that at least in our generation, the technology does not exist to allow fully automated flying, at least passengers. Maybe perhaps boxes or things that, if the aircraft is lost or crashed, it's a loss of revenue, not a loss of human life. So I think that at least today, the way we sit today, that we always need that human interface to the machine, because the human has the ability to take abstract, random concepts that may or may not be related to each other and combine them into a cognitive, cognizant, rational picture to help make decisions. And I don't think machines are there yet.
That's great. And coming at it from a completely different angle, just as far as will passengers get on those airplanes, I think as long as the traveling public was not a generation of people going to their soccer activities or whatnot in driverless cars, I tend to think people are going to demand someone with skin in the game get on, be at the helm.
And in relating it to this conversation even further to the Tesla, because I think it's something that a lot of your listeners, perhaps if they don't fly, are familiar with. And in driving the Tesla, when I drive a regular car, if I pass a cyclist, because I'm really interested in cycling, it's something that's another one of my passions. I give the cyclist a lot of room because I don't want to get that close to them. I don't want to disturb them. And depending on the age of the cyclist, I might give them more room. For instance, if it's a child on a bike, I'm going to give them a ton of room. Now, the Tesla, when it drives by a cyclist, it tells you a cyclist beside you. The car doesn't shift to the left side of the road to give them more room. And doesn't have the ability to distinguish perhaps an older cyclist who probably knows what they're doing to a child who might be very unpredictable on a bike. So that's the kind of thinking that is not yet in automated systems in cars or in aviation. And that is the critical function of the pilot right now, to be able to take disparate, pieces of information, a young child on a bike that could be unpredictable, and make them into a rational cognitive thought. Oh, I have to give this child more room when I pass them on the car and at a slower speed so I don't scare them or startle them or get that close to them. So that's what's missing from automated systems as we know them today.
I think I'm down to what is probably my last question, unless you have anything that you want to talk about in addition to. And I don't know. I think part of the reason why I asked this question is because I envision maybe a future mashup mix of all different pilots of all different backgrounds and ability levels. I like asking this question. Well, and it's a multi-part question. What makes a good pilot? What makes a good captain? what makes a good first officer, what makes a good crew member in general? Answer that any way you'd like.
I think you would start about what makes a good pilot. A good pilot is technically competent at flying the airplane. That's, they can fly the airplane. I think that's the first thing that makes a good pilot. They have the passion and curiosity to realize that what they did today and what they know today is not good enough for tomorrow. And that they always have to challenge themselves to be a better pilot. And by that, either perhaps more flying skills, perhaps more reading and involvement about emerging technologies, about what's coming next, and about a thought process of, we talked about before, just not going for an airplane ride and actually flying the airplane, not flying the airplane and discussing your new house on Zillow, what it's worth. Perhaps, flying and discussing, products such as SkyPath. Where's the turbulence? Where am I going to sit the flight attendants? What am I looking for as fuel reserves? What's my destination weather? Do I need an alternate? And you know, and I think that makes a good pilot. What makes a good captain? What makes a good captain is someone who realizes that one, they are in command of the airplane, that they are legally responsible for that airplane and all its passengers. And everything that happens that goes good, they can take credit for, and everything that goes bad, even if it's not their fault, it's their fault because they're in command of the airplane. But they should also foster an environment that gets the best out of their crew members. Their first officer primarily, the flight attendants, their dispatcher, their gate agent, that really fosters that open and honest communication and never taking themselves too seriously. And I think that's something that your dad really, I don't think he ever took himself too seriously. It is great as the wisdom he had. And I think that he always looked at himself with a particular eye for humor. And I think he was, although I never had the opportunity to fly with him, I wish that I did in a professional capacity. I think that he got the best from his crew members. And I think he was a great pilot and in command of the airplane. But I think if you asked the people that flew with him, they would say they really enjoyed flying with him because he was technically proficient, but he got the best out of the people that he worked with. And they're really the best out of the people that he knew. And what makes a good first officer? A good first officer, again, technically proficient about flying the airplane, but also a good advocate and support of the captain, realizing that, look, the captain has to make the decision. I'm going to provide all the information and all the opinions that I can. But once the captain makes what I would say a safe, reasonable, and technically sound decision, they have to support that decision. And, even if that's a decision that they may or may not have made. And I think that's what makes a good first officer, advocating and giving the captain as much information as they can up to the point where a decision is made, and then actively supporting that decision. And underlying the basis of all of that is really being a great technically competent pilot.
That's great. That's great. Mike, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Scott, it was really a pleasure to talk to you, and I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.